My parents betrayed me. First, they wanted to take my club through court, and then they ruined my business for a round sum of $5,000. So now I have sued them. Hey, Reddit. I've spent the last couple of hours staring at this screen, wondering if I should really post this. You know, that weird moment where you want to share but also feel like it's opening a part of your soul to strangers? Well, I guess here goes nothing. This is my story. A story of pain, survival, betrayal, and somehow, through it all, finding a way out. I'm hoping that maybe someone out there will understand, and maybe I can start piecing together the shattered parts of me. I don't know if you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own home, but that was my reality growing up. My parents, Richard and Teresa, were the kind of people who shouldn't have had kids, but they did. And unfortunately, I was the one who had to suffer for it. From the moment I could form memories, I remember feeling unwanted, like I was some kind of mistake. My father, Richard, was cold and distant, but it was more than that. He was a tyrant. No, scratch that. He was a monster in a suit, someone who used intimidation and fear to control every part of my life. My mother, Teresa, wasn't much better. She had this talent for manipulation, this ability to twist every little thing into my fault. She was the queen of guilt-tripping, using her sweet voice to convince the outside world that she was the perfect mother while making my life a living hell. It was like I had two versions of my parents, the ones the world saw and the real versions, the ones I lived with every day. On the surface, we were this average middle-class family, living in a decent neighborhood, with decent jobs, and doing what normal families do. But that was just a mask, one they wore so well. Behind closed doors, it was a war zone. Nothing I did was ever good enough. Not my grades, not my behavior, not even my very existence. I remember one time when I was about 9 years old, I brought home a B+ on a math test. I was actually proud of it, considering how hard I'd studied for it. But when my father saw the grade, he didn't even look at me. He just shook his head and muttered something about how I was going to be a failure if I didn't get my act together. That was my father. No words of encouragement, no recognition of effort, just disappointment. My mother was worse. She would tell me things like, "You know, your father works so hard for this family, and you can't even be good at school? You're just like your father's brother, and you know how that turned out." Her favorite comparison was to my uncle, who had been disowned by the family for being an alcoholic and a gambler. That was her way of letting me know I was worthless, just like him. But the physical abuse, that was another story altogether. My father had this habit of turning small, insignificant moments into punishable offenses. I could be standing in his way, or maybe I didn't answer fast enough when he asked me a question, and he would explode. His temper was terrifying. He would throw things, punch holes in the walls, and on more than one occasion, he took it out on me. I would walk into school with bruises on my arms, my back, or my legs, and the teachers would just look away. It was like they knew but didn't want to get involved. Classic case of, not my problem. School was the only place where I could breathe, though. As miserable as I was at home, at least when I stepped into the school building, I wasn't in immediate danger. Sure, I had anxiety, and I was always on edge, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't like walking on eggshells around my father. And despite the trauma I carried with me every day, I managed to find a group of friends who made life bearable. We weren't the most popular kids in school, but we didn't care. We had each other, and that was all that mattered. My closest friend was Jake. He was the loud, sarcastic type, the one who could always make me laugh even when I felt like everything was falling apart. He had his own set of issues at home, but he never let it show. Then there was Max, the quiet one. He didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He had this way of observing everything, understanding people in ways most others couldn't. And then there was Emma. Emma was like the glue that held us all together. She was smart, compassionate, and always had this sense of optimism, even when the rest of us were spiraling. The four of us became inseparable. We spent almost every day together, either at school or at Jake's house, which was a safe haven for us all. His parents were the opposite of mine. Kind, understanding, and, most importantly, they let us be ourselves without judgment. I think, in a way, that's why I gravitated toward Jake's family. They showed me what a real family was supposed to look like. A family that loved and supported each other, not one that tore each other down. As the years went by, things at home only got worse. By the time I was in high school, the emotional and physical abuse had escalated. My father would come home from work, find something to complain about, and then take his frustrations out on me. It didn't matter if I was doing homework or just trying to stay out of his way. If he was in a bad mood, I was the one who paid the price. My mother, ever the enabler, would stand by and watch. Sometimes she would even egg him on, saying things like, "Maybe this will teach you to be a better son." It was sickening. I tried to focus on school, on my friends, and on anything that would distract me from the hell that was my life at home. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stuck in a never-ending cycle of misery. I started to withdraw from everything. My grades slipped, my friendships started to strain, and I became a shell of the person I used to be. I could feel myself sinking, but I didn't know how to ask for help. That's when I made the decision to drop out. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It had been building for months, maybe even years. I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The constant abuse from my parents, the anxiety of trying to keep up with school, the overwhelming feeling that I was never going to be good enough. It was all too much. So, one day, I walked into school, went to the principal's office, and told them I was done. I was dropping out. I think they were shocked at first, but they didn't fight me on it. They could see how checked out I was, how much I had already given up. I was a lost cause in their eyes. Telling my friends was the hardest part. I remember the look on Emma's face when I told her. She looked like she was about to cry, but she held it together. Max just nodded, his usual quiet self, and Jake? Well, Jake made a joke about how he always knew I'd be the first one to drop out. But behind the sarcasm, I could tell he was worried. My parents, of course, lost their minds. My father raged for hours, calling me every name in the book, telling me I was a disgrace to the family. My mother was no better. She cried and played the victim, telling everyone who would listen that I was ungrateful, that I was throwing my life away. But I didn't care. I couldn't care anymore. I had reached my breaking point. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life after that. I had no plan, no direction. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The abuse, the constant belittling, it was destroying me. I needed a way out, and fast. That's when I decided to apply to university. It seemed like a long shot, especially since I had dropped out of high school, but I figured it was worth a try. To my surprise, I got in. Not to some Ivy League school or anything, but a decent university nonetheless. It was my ticket out, my chance to escape the hell that was my life. I packed my bags and left as soon as I could. My parents didn't try to stop me. In fact, I think they were relieved to be rid of me. They didn't want me around any more than I wanted to be there. University was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free from the constant scrutiny, free from the abuse, free to be myself. It wasn't easy, though. The scars my parents left on me, both physical and emotional, didn't just disappear because I was in a new place. I carried that trauma with me everywhere I went, but at least I was away from them. I made new friends at university, but I never let go of the ones I had. Jake, Max, and Emma were still by my side, even if we weren't physically together as often. We kept in touch, and every time I came home for breaks, we would meet up, talk about life, and plan for the future. We had this running joke that one day we would all pack up and move to some random city where no one knew us, where we could start fresh and leave all the bullshit behind. It was a dream, something we talked about when things got tough, but none of us ever really thought it would happen. Until it did. It was the end of my third year of university when things started to spiral out of control again. My father, for reasons I still don't fully understand, showed up at my university one day. He was angry, of course. He always was. But this time, it was different. He didn't just want to yell at me. He wanted to bring me home. He made this huge scene in front of everyone, demanding that I pack up my things and leave with him. He called me a failure, a disappointment, and told me that if I didn't come home, I was dead to him. That was the last straw. I wasn't going back. I couldn't go back. I called Jake that night, and we talked for hours. He knew I was at my breaking point, and for the first time, we weren't just joking about running away. We were serious. The next day, I called Max and Emma, and within a week, we had a plan. We didn't know where we were going, But we knew we had to leave. We pooled our money, packed our bags, and said goodbye to the only place we had ever known. We left in the middle of the night, driving for hours until we reached a city none of us had ever been to before. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. We didn't have a place to stay, we didn't have jobs, and we had no idea what the future held. But we were together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. The first few weeks were rough. We found a cheap, run-down apartment that we could barely afford, and we lived off ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. But we didn't care. We were free. We spent our days exploring the city, looking for jobs, and trying to figure out what the hell we were doing. It was chaotic, but it was ours. Of course, my parents didn't take my disappearance lightly. They called me constantly, left voicemails, sent emails, anything to try and drag me back into their web. But I ignored them. I knew if I gave in, if I went back, it would be the end of me. So I cut them off completely, changed my number, blocked them on every platform, and made sure they had no way of contacting me. That's where I am now, sitting in a tiny apartment with my friends, still figuring out what the next step is. We're not rich, we're not successful, and we sure as hell don't have everything figured out. But we're trying. We're doing it on our own terms, and that's more than I ever thought was possible. Hey Reddit, it's me again. It's been a while since I updated you on my story. If you've been following along, you know that my friends and I escaped from a life of abuse and struggle, packed everything up, and moved to a new city to start fresh. Back then, I was just a scared kid with nothing but a bag of clothes, some friends by my side, and a lot of uncertainty about the future. Well, a lot has changed since then, and not all of it went the way we expected. So, here's what happened after we made that big leap. After we moved to the new city, we were living pretty much day by day. The small apartment we had found was hardly livable, cracked walls, barely any furniture, and an ever-present smell of mildew. We didn't care, though. It was freedom. At least we were away from our old lives, our parents, and all the things that had made us feel like we were suffocating. But living on nothing but ramen and cheap beer wasn't sustainable, and soon enough, the excitement of starting fresh was overshadowed by the harsh reality that we were broke, and life wasn't just going to hand us a miracle. That's when we met Leo. Leo was a whirlwind of charisma. He wasn't much older than us, maybe in his mid-20s, but he carried himself like he had seen and done everything there was to do. He was the kind of guy who always had the best story to tell at a party, the guy who knew a guy who could get you whatever you needed, no questions asked. At first, we didn't trust him. I mean, how could we? He was way too smooth, too self-assured. But when you're desperate, trust comes easier than it should. Leo made his money in ways that weren't exactly legal, but they weren't quite illegal either. He lived in that gray zone where hustlers thrive. We met him through one of Jake's old acquaintances from high school. Jake was always the type to know people, and in this case, his connections paid off, sort of. One night, we were sitting around in our dingy apartment, wondering how we were going to make rent for the next month, when Jake said, "Hey, I know this guy who might be able to help us out. He's a bit unconventional, but he's made a lot of money, and he's looking for partners." I wasn't keen on the idea at first. I mean, the last thing I wanted was to get involved in something shady, but at the same time, what were our options? We were broke, barely getting by, and the jobs we had lined up weren't paying enough to cover our bills. Max was working part-time as a tech support guy, Emma was still waiting tables, and Jake and I were picking up odd jobs wherever we could. None of us were making more than a few $100 a month, and it wasn't enough. So, we decided to meet Leo. The first time we met him, I knew this guy was different. He was dressed sharp, had this air of confidence that made you instantly feel like you were dealing with someone who had it all figured out. Leo was the kind of guy who could sell sand in the desert. He just had that way about him. He sat us down at this trendy coffee shop in town, bought us all drinks, and started talking. "So, you guys want to make some money, right?" he said, smiling like he already knew the answer. "I've got a way for you to do it. Fast. Simple. No strings attached." At this point, we were all ears. Leo started explaining his plan, something he called the Bureau. The idea was simple. We'd buy shares of small, struggling companies that no one had ever heard of, and then sell those shares to people looking to invest at rock-bottom prices. The trick was that the companies we were dealing with were barely hanging on. Most of them were on the verge of bankruptcy, but we would spin it like they were undervalued and poised for a turnaround. In short, it was a hustle. And while it wasn't outright illegal, it was certainly unethical. At first, we hesitated. I mean, we weren't exactly saints, but none of us wanted to end up behind bars for some quick cash. But Leo was convincing. He laid it all out, how easy it was, how we wouldn't get caught, how we'd make more money in a few months than we ever would working minimum wage jobs. He even threw in some numbers, showing us how he'd done this before and made a killing. "I'm not saying you'll be millionaires," Leo said with a grin, "but you'll be a hell of a lot better off than you are right now." Jake was the first to jump on board, no surprise there. He'd always been the one willing to take risks, and he had a natural talent for convincing people to follow his lead. Max, being the tech guy, saw the potential for us to automate most of the process, which would make things easier and less risky. Emma wasn't thrilled with the idea. She was the one who always tried to keep us grounded, to remind us of the consequences. But even she knew we were running out of options. And me? I knew it was a bad idea from the start, but I couldn't deny the temptation. The thought of finally getting ahead, of not worrying about rent or bills, was too powerful to ignore. So, we did it. We became the bureau. The first few weeks were slow. We were still getting the hang of things, learning how to pitch the stocks, figuring out who to target, and trying to get people to trust us enough to invest. Leo taught us how to talk to potential buyers, how to make them believe in the potential of these failing companies. Jake, with his natural charisma, became our main salesman. He could talk anyone into anything, and it wasn't long before he was closing deals left and right. Max set up our website, creating a sleek, professional front that made us look like a legitimate investment firm. He even rigged it so that everything looked legal: fake documents, fake company profiles, the whole 9 yards. It was scary how good he was at it. Emma handled the books, keeping track of the money coming in and making sure everything was organized. She didn't like what we were doing, but she kept her mouth shut. And me? I was somewhere in the middle, helping out wherever I could, trying not to think too hard about the fact that we were basically conning people out of their money. Surprisingly, it worked. People started buying. Not a lot at first, but enough to keep us afloat. Then, as word spread, more and more people came to us, looking to get in on these undervalued stocks. It was insane how fast things escalated. Within a few months, we were pulling in thousands of dollars in profit, way more than we had ever expected. It felt like we were on top of the world. We had money, we had freedom, and for the first time in a long time, we didn't feel like we were just surviving. We were thriving. We even upgraded our apartment, moving into a nicer place with actual furniture and a kitchen that didn't look like it was about to fall apart. But with success came paranoia. The bigger we got, the more we started to worry about getting caught. We were walking a fine line, and we all knew it. Every time the phone rang, my heart would skip a beat, thinking it was the police or some pissed-off investor coming to shut us down. We had gotten in too deep, and now we were stuck. Leo, of course, didn't seem to care. He kept telling us we were untouchable, that no one would catch on as long as we played it cool. Then we met Mike. Mike was one of our buyers, one of the more serious ones. He wasn't like the other people we had been dealing with. Most of our clients didn't know much about investing. They just wanted to make a quick buck. But Mike? He knew his stuff. He started asking questions we couldn't answer. He wanted to see financial reports, balance sheets, and proof that these companies we were selling shares in were legitimate. At first, we tried to brush him off, but Mike wasn't having it. He kept digging, kept pushing, and eventually, he threatened to report us. That's when we knew we had to shut it down. We couldn't risk it anymore. One wrong move, and everything we had built would come crashing down. So we stopped. The bureau was over. It wasn't an easy decision, but we all knew it was the right one. We had made good money, more than enough to start fresh again, and it wasn't worth the risk of getting caught. We shut down the website, wiped all our records, and disappeared from the radar. For a while, it felt like we were walking on eggshells, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing happened. Mike never followed through on his threat, and no one came after us. We were free. But now, we had a new problem. What the hell were we going to do with all the money we had made? That's when Jake came up with the idea to open a gaming club. It wasn't as crazy as it sounded. We had all grown up playing video games, and with the rise of esports and gaming culture, opening a gaming club seemed like the perfect way to turn our ill-gotten gains into something legitimate. Plus, it would give us a chance to build something we actually cared about, something real. We pooled our money and found this old building in the city. It was a wreck, but it had potential. Over the next few months, we worked day and night, renovating the place, turning it into the ultimate gaming hangout. We bought top-of-the-line gaming PCs, consoles, and even some old-school arcade machines. The walls were covered in neon lights and posters from all our favorite games. It was the kind of place we would have killed to hang out in when we were younger. We called it the Nexus, and it didn't take long for it to become a hit. At first, it was just a few regulars, college kids and locals who wanted a place to chill and play games. But as word spread, more and more people started showing up. We hosted tournaments, streamed esports events, and even started a small team of our own. The Nexus became the go-to spot for gamers in the city, and we were finally making money the right way. Things were going well, really well. But then, as always, life threw us a curveball. One night, while we were closing up the club, a man walked in. He was older, in his 40s, wearing a suit that looked out of place in our little gaming haven. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, and right away, I felt my stomach drop. I thought for sure this was it. The Bureau had caught up with us. But instead, Harris pulled out a picture of Leo. "Have you seen this man?" he asked. Leo had vanished months ago, without a word. One day he was there, helping us set up the Nexus, and the next, he was gone. His phone was disconnected, and his apartment was empty. We had no idea where he went or why he left. Detective Harris explained that Leo was involved in something much bigger than we realized, something that had caught the attention of law enforcement. I told the detective the truth. We hadn't seen or heard from Leo since he disappeared. Harris didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push it. He gave us his card and told us to call if we heard anything. After he left, we sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Leo had always been a little shady, but we had no idea he was mixed up in something serious enough to get the cops involved. That night, we made a pact. No more shady deals, no more risks. We were going to keep the Nexus clean and legit, no matter what. Since then, things have been good. We've expanded the Nexus, opened a second location, and even started thinking about branching out into other areas, maybe opening a cafe or a tech repair shop. We're building something real, something we're proud of, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like we're on the right path. But I still think about Leo sometimes. Where is he now? Is he on the run? Did he get caught? Or is he out there somewhere, living a new life, just like we are? I guess we'll never know. For now, we're just focused on the future, on building something that lasts. We've come a long way from the days of the Bureau, and while I don't regret what we did to get here, I know we were lucky to get out when we did. Hey, Reddit. It's been a while since I last updated you, and things have gotten intense. If you followed my story so far, you know that I left a toxic life behind, moved to a new city with my friends, and started a successful gaming club called the Nexus. Life was good, really good, for the first time in years. But just when I thought I'd left my past behind, it came crashing back in a way I never expected. This is the story of how my parents tried to take me down and nearly destroyed everything I worked for. Spoiler, they failed. It had been almost 4 years since I last saw my parents, Richard and Teresa, and honestly, I had hoped I'd never see them again. After everything they put me through as a kid, constant abuse, manipulation, and outright hatred, I thought they were gone for good. But the thing about toxic people is that they always find a way to weasel back into your life, especially when they see you're doing better without them. A few months ago, I started getting these strange phone calls, blocked numbers, long stretches of silence, then a hang-up. It was annoying, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I chalked it up to prank callers, or maybe even telemarketers who were too lazy to leave a message. It wasn't until the letters started arriving that I began to feel something darker brewing. The first one was a simple and signed note. You can't run from your past forever. Cryptic? Sure, but I ignored it. I had a business to run, and I wasn't about to let some creepy anonymous message ruin my good thing. But then the letters started getting more personal, mentioning my parents, the abuse, and even alluding to my friends, Jake, Max, and Emma. That's when I started to worry. Whoever was behind this knew way too much about me. The day my parents showed up at the Nexus was a day I'll never forget. Jake had been manning the front desk while I was holed up in the office, going over some financials. I heard the door chime but didn't think much of it. People came and went all day. But then Jake burst into the office, looking pale as a sheet. "They're here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, not sure what he was talking about. "Who's here?" He didn't have to answer. The moment I walked out to the front, I saw them, Richard and Teresa, standing in the middle of my club, looking as out of place as you can imagine. It was like seeing ghosts. My heart dropped, and for a moment, I felt like I was that scared kid all over again, waiting for the next verbal or physical blow. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I took a deep breath and walked over to them. They looked older, of course. Richard had gray in his hair now, and Teresa had a few more wrinkles, but their expressions hadn't changed. My father still had that hard, cold look in his eyes, and my mother's face was twisted into her usual mask of forced pleasantry. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not bothering to hide the anger in my voice. My father smirked, a condescending tilt to his head. "Well, we heard about your success," he said, his tone oozing with disdain. "Seems like our little failure actually managed to make something of himself." I bit back the urge to yell, "What do you want?" Teresa stepped forward, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We thought, since we're your parents, and we did so much to raise you, it would only be fair if we got involved in your business. A partnership of sorts." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd done to me, everything I'd survived, they had the audacity to show up here and act like I owed them something? I laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. It was disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Richard's face hardened. "We're not joking. You've built something impressive, but you could use help from people with experience. We can help you expand, make this thing bigger than you ever imagined." I shook my head, my fists clenched at my sides. "No, absolutely not. You don't get to walk in here and act like you're entitled to anything. You weren't there for me. You did nothing but tear me down my entire life, and now you think I'm just going to let you waltz into my business? Get out." Teresa's smile faltered. "We're your parents. Blood is thicker than water. Don't make this harder than it has to be." My stomach churned at the sound of her voice, the way she twisted everything to make it sound like she was the victim. But I wasn't that scared, broken kid anymore. I had built this business with my own hands, alongside my friends, and there was no way I was letting them ruin it. I stepped closer, glaring at them. "You made it clear a long time ago that you don't care about me. You only care about yourselves. Now leave, or I'll have you thrown out." They didn't argue. Richard's eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But they turned and left without another word. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer. My parents were taking me to court. They were claiming that they were entitled to a share of the Nexus, arguing that they had supported me financially, and that I owed them compensation for all the years they had spent raising me. I was furious. The thought of my parents, people who had done nothing but abuse and manipulate me, trying to take away the one thing I had built for myself, was infuriating. They hadn't supported me. They had been the very reason I left in the first place, and now they were trying to worm their way back into my life for money. I hired a lawyer, a tough-as-nails woman named Jessica that Emma had recommended. Jessica didn't take shit from anyone, and the moment I told her the situation, she was all in. "We're going to fight this," she said, her voice full of determination. "They don't have a leg to stand on, but we need to be prepared. People like your parents don't go down without a fight." The next few weeks were a nightmare. My parents' lawyer, this smug, overconfident guy named Robert, was relentless. They requested all sorts of financial records, business documents, and personal information, hoping to find something they could use against me. It was clear they were trying to overwhelm us, to make us feel like we were drowning in legal paperwork. But Jessica was a fighter. She tore their arguments apart piece by piece, pointing out that I had been financially independent for years, that my parents had never contributed to my business, and that their claims were completely baseless. Still, the stress of it all was taking its toll. My friends were worried, especially Emma. She kept telling me to take breaks, to step away from the chaos for a while, but how could I? This was my livelihood on the line, and the thought of my parents winning made my blood boil. The court date finally arrived, and walking into that courtroom was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. I had never been in a legal battle before, and seeing my parents sitting there, looking so calm and composed, made my stomach churn. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The trial was brutal. My parents' lawyer painted them as the victims, loving parents who had sacrificed so much for their ungrateful child. They spun this whole story about how they had supported me emotionally and financially, how they had always believed in me, and how now that I was successful, I was selfishly cutting them out of my life. I could barely sit still as they lied through their teeth. But when it was my turn to testify, I didn't hold back. I told the court everything. About the years of abuse, the manipulation, the emotional and physical scars they had left me with. I laid it all bare, and it wasn't easy. Reliving those memories in front of strangers, in front of my parents, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But I needed the truth to come out. I needed them to see who my parents really were. When the trial was over, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. I had done everything I could. Now, all I could do was wait. A week later, the verdict came in. The judge ruled in my favor. My parents had no claim to my business, no right to any of the money I had earned, and they were ordered to cover all legal costs. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. I hadn't wanted to go to court in the first place. I just wanted them out of my life. But of course, they couldn't leave well enough alone. The day after the court ruling, I walked into the Nexus and felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The front windows were shattered, the neon signs we had installed were broken, and inside, it was even worse. Gaming stations had been smashed, monitors destroyed, arcade machines overturned. The place was a wreck. It was like someone had taken a bat to everything we had worked so hard to build. My heart sank as I stood there, staring at the destruction. Jake and Max were with me, and I could see the disbelief on their faces too. Who the hell would do this? Max muttered, running a hand through his hair as he surveyed the damage. But I knew. I didn't have proof, but I knew. My parents had lost in court, and this was their way of taking revenge. They couldn't beat me legally, so they were going to try and destroy me another way. We called the police, of course. They came, took pictures, filed a report, but I could tell they weren't optimistic about catching whoever did it. Vandalism cases like this rarely get solved, especially when there's no obvious trail to follow. But I wasn't about to let it go. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. That's when I decided to hire a private detective. Enter Detective Markson. He wasn't the kind of detective you see in movies. No trench coat, no fedora, no gruff attitude. He was just a regular guy in his late 40s, wearing a well-tailored suit and sporting a calm, measured demeanor. He had a reputation for getting results, and that's exactly what I needed. I told him everything about my parents, the court case, and the vandalism. He listened carefully, taking notes, but didn't say much at first. When I finished, he nodded. "I'll look into it," he said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll dig around and see what I can find. People like your parents usually slip up somewhere along the line." Markson started his investigation immediately. He pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses, interviewed people in the area, and followed up on every lead he could find. It didn't take long for him to start piecing things together. The break came when Markson found security footage from a gas station down the street from the Nexus. Late at night, just hours before the vandalism occurred, Richard's car was spotted pulling into the station. He got out, filled the tank, and then drove off in the direction of the Nexus. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. Markson kept digging, and eventually, he found the smoking gun. A witness, someone who lived in the apartment building across from the Nexus, had seen two people outside the club late that night. They couldn't identify them, but they remembered hearing one of them shout something like, "He'll regret this." It wasn't much, but it was enough to link my parents to the crime. I had the evidence I needed. With Markson's help, we gathered everything: the surveillance footage, the witness testimony, and the timing of it all, and prepared to take my parents to court again. This time, it wasn't about defending myself. This time, I was going on the offensive. I didn't think I could handle another court case so soon after the first, but there I was, sitting in the same courtroom, staring at my parents across the aisle. They looked more nervous this time, though. They knew the evidence was stacked against them, and no amount of manipulation or lies could save them now. Their lawyer tried to dismiss the evidence, calling it circumstantial, but Markson's investigation was airtight. Between the footage, the witness, and the fact that they had a clear motive, it was obvious that my parents had orchestrated the vandalism. They were desperate to ruin me, and they had resorted to criminal behavior to do it. The trial lasted a week, and by the end of it, the outcome was clear. The judge ruled in my favor again. My parents were found guilty of vandalizing the Nexus, and they were ordered to pay damages, enough to cover the cost of repairs and then some. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to send a message. They couldn't mess with me anymore. It's been a month since that second court ruling, and things have finally started to settle down. The Nexus is back up and running, better than ever. We used the compensation money to not only repair the damage but also upgrade our equipment, and business has been booming since then. As for my parents, I haven't heard from them since the trial, and honestly, I hope I never do again. They've been officially cut out of my life, legally and emotionally, and I've finally made peace with the fact that they'll never change. My friends, Jake, Max, and Emma, have been my rock through all of this. Without them, I don't think I could have gotten through these last few months. We've built something amazing together, and no one, not even my parents, can take that away from us. So, that's where I am now, Reddit. From a scared kid who ran away from his abusive parents to a successful business owner who fought back and won. It's been a crazy journey, and I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of it.